I feel like they still wouldn't quite actually be able to bridge the gap between personal consciousness and the material world.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I'm suggesting that their point of view is that they will be able to explain the conscious phenomenon in terms that make sense to us on this other physical scientific level. And I think it's plausible. I don't know. I mean, it's called the hard problem of consciousness for a reason.
I think it's just sort of I think that most philosophy starts with an intuition or experience that isn't exactly based on language. So I think that saying that neuroscience will solve that isn't necessarily false. It's just sort of like a neuroscientific language.
Yeah.
So if you just like sort of like understand that either way you're discussing an experience like raw or just like intuition, it's still like pretty accurate.
Yeah, there's sort of pre-scientific ways we had of talking about gold and silver and other minerals and chemicals and stuff that I think with science, we have actually not just a different language to talk about it, but much better understanding of that stuff. And I think that's what I mean when philosophy is getting narrower, that the sciences are explaining things in a way that that is actually adding to our knowledge about those topics, in a way that is only possible through that sort of scientific method. And I think that neuroscientists with a philosophical bent, or people who are philosophers with a neuroscientific bent, they want to say that we will be able to get that kind of understanding with consciousness too.
So we reduce it down to what they can understand.
Well, right, and the same thing could have been said for people trying to come up with the periodic table. Well, sure, you can tell me how many neutrons are in the nucleus of this atom, but that doesn't tell me what it's like to have a piece of gold in my hand. Okay, but it does tell you something.
It seems though like there are, like in the history of philosophy, there are sort of like certain fundamental questions which previously had led to aiming at the sciences, but which sort of through various, historical and theoretical means sort of did get taken up by sort of empiricisms, like practical technological advances or aiming at technology. But the questions that started it and that were fundamental to the philosophers trying to do natural science haven't been answered by natural sciences. It's just the reason for philosophers looking to natural science to answer those questions have sort of been dismissed. So I mean, I feel like the separation from the natural sciences is more like a skepticism towards natural sciences than rather than natural sciences being way more successful as well. So
I think that's a good point. I think that's definitely a common view among philosophers that they're either doing it wrong or they don't quite get what I mean. And I think that regardless of how good science gets, there's always going to be a place for philosophy. The broadest kind of questions about what it is to live life and what it is to know things, that I think those can't be answered anywhere. I'm not sure who was first here.
Go ahead.
Well, I agree with you perfectly, Matt, that philosophy will stay, but for a different reason as well. As science has become more and more specialized in order to answer these difficult questions, they tend to alienate the layman more and more and more and more. Right. I mean, eventually, you won't be able to exactly, even though these answers have been provided to you on the table, basically,
right,
you still won't be able to know them without the proper background. Kind of like quantum physics in physics.
Yeah.
You actually have to know a lot to be able to understand that.
I think that's true. Like, science there's so much scientific knowledge. Nobody can hold it in their minds. No one person can do that. And the thing about philosophy is the questions it asks are not just important to a specialized branch of human beings. They're important to all human beings. I think that in your everyday life, the kind of daily life that Hume says we should carry on with, regardless of what our philosophy tells us, I think that you have philosophical ideas that guide the way you live your daily life. And you don't have a choice about having these ideas. And so you can either accept the ideas through osmosis that are around you, or you can choose to examine these ideas explicitly. And I think probably we're here at the Philosophy Club because we like thinking about these ideas and deciding whether or not we should accept them or not. And dang it, everybody should too. Jake?
No, actually, you that basically made my point, and I just wanted to clarify. I think I'm not sure if I understood properly what you had said, because I think you kind of.
I went off on a different thing.
Yeah,
go back to
you
Joe.
went off on it, but I mean, are you basically saying that we're left with what's important because the easy questions have been answered, and that's where science?
I think the methodology of looking to the physical world was, I mean, like, basically issues of skepticism made knowledge of, like, sort of the physical world, like how certain physical phenomenon happen, like, pretty irrelevant to certain fundamental questions of philosophy. Like, it's not very useful to know how fire starts when you're trying to answer what truth is. And I think that's pretty much what I was saying, is that philosophy has, I mean, separated from the natural sciences at least partially because there weren't the answers to the questions they wanted in the natural sciences. I mean, the questions that they were asking weren't answered in the natural sciences. And so the natural sciences were doing one thing, answering these particular sort of physical phenomena. And at first, philosophers thought, looking at these physical phenomena will answer my philosophical questions. And then as time progressed, they found that they didn't. They had to ask deeper questions, and so they stopped looking at those physical phenomena.
It's interesting because I always believed that all of those deep questions always existed, as well as questions which science has since answered. Therefore, the hardest questions, the ones that is beyond the realm of science, I don't believe that philosophy broke off from natural sciences. I believe the sciences broke off from philosophy, and that the original questions were those that science.
But they were probably convinced that eventually we would become irrelevant.
Like, I think that's probably a good insight. That it's not that, it's more like the.
It was mutual.
Yeah, it was mutual. The scientific knowledge became a lot more specific and specialized, and no longer important to every human being.
Right.
And.
So I think. So you think they may be switching places eventually?
Well, I don't.
Philosophy is like going to be the science of the common man, and
no.
sciences are going to be.
I don't think that there's a conflict between the two. I think they're different types. I think they're different disciplines. Yeah. So, what do you guys think? Hume, Berkeley, skeptics, or not? Let's take a vote.
Take a vote.
Skeptics.
Wait, are we voting on both at the same time? We can't.
Berkeley.
Yeah.
Berkeley is
Hume.
not a skeptic.
Sure.
Yeah, right.
I mean, come on.
I'm sorry.
No, I think he's skeptical about material objects, but that's very limited.
I think, yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. He's skeptical about real objects. Hume is skeptical about the possibility of our knowledge about matters of fact, and
Causality.
yeah, and because of our. So I think that if you view skepticism as a radical doubt about the possibility of knowledge about physical objects or about the world, then they're both skeptics. If you have some different idea of skepticism, then they may or may not.
Very good.
I think
that Hume was uncomfortable with his skepticism.
Yeah.
And that's an indicator that probably we are uneasy with that kind of radical skepticism.
I think we are too.
It's you can't live according to it.
Yeah, yeah, and what's the point of getting to a philosophy that tells you, don't do anything, sit around and die? That seems like, why would you even pick up the philosophy to begin with?
It's a hell of a philosophy.
Good thing Hume told us is to go out and drink.
Well, that's true. But Hume was saying, don't listen to the philosophy when it tells you to do that. Go have a drink. But I think there's also something to be said for the fact that the reason why we think of Hume's skeptical ideas, Descartes' skeptical ideas, Berkeley's skeptical ideas, as the most important of their ideas, because regardless of the practical effects of carrying through a philosophy, we're going to say, well, if it's right, if it follows logically, or if it's right, we should hold on to it. We should follow through with it. And that's why it's sort of dissatisfying when he says, well, it seems to be right, but
The way I deal with it in my class too is that Hume and Kant together were like a 1-2 punch to the correspondence theory of truth, and
Yeah.
that therefore that what we began to start looking for is another way of accounting for the truth besides correspondence afterward. And we might not have found it, but it seemed like correspondence was pretty much knocked out of the ballpark, so
Yeah.
to speak.
That could be the next,
Yeah.
you know, if there was a part 2, it would be Kant, skeptic.
Yeah, and his skepticism is rather interesting because he needs
In this idea
to
of
be
skepticism.
skeptical about the in itself in order to support his religious and moral views.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
You don't know. Well, that's Kant. That's a different animal. Does anybody else have anything they want to say about skepticism or anything like that?
Stephen Hicks writes in his book on postmodernism that radical skepticism of the Hume and Kant variety were pretty much anti-enlightenment, and pretty much led to the eventual rise of postmodernists, such as Lyotard.
Yeah.
I mean, Derrida.
Yeah. So instead of like the Enlightenment sort of classical, rational sort of stuff in art, for example, you get atonal music and abstract art.
Yeah,
and,
because
No,
it's
that's actually
meaningless.
modernist.
okay, yeah, but you're right. Yeah, but that's post Enlightenment.
Yeah, post-enlightenment, sure.
Well, I think too that
Postmodern,
holds
Andy
together with
Warhol.
the sort of the
Yeah.
erosion of the correspondence theory of truth. That once you jettison that, then you really are into
Although
a different historical.
Kant did say
epoch.
James.
Well, Hume cast doubt on God too, though. If you
He
cast
sure
doubt
did.
on Atomic materialism and you cast doubt on God, then it's sort of like having your cake and eating it too.
Yeah.
It doesn't leave very much except you.
Except to go to have a drink. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think Hume in his first order skepticism of being critical and wanting to have good reasons for believing things, he's in that mode when he's questioning God, and he says when talking about miracles, he says, well, you should probably proportion your belief. You should ration your belief in proportion to the evidence.
Of course, his other skeptical view, cause and effect, actually leaves quite large space for miracles to happen.
Yeah, it totally does. but he says, well, we've got the custom and habit though, so let's hang on to that. So, I mean, thanks very much for coming, guys. I think this was a fun discussion for me anyway. So I hope you liked it.
Did you record it?
Dude,
I
Kant
did.
is